Star Wars was once untouchable, a cornerstone of pop culture that could do no wrong. But Disney's takeover has turned it into a shadow of its former self. Broken promises, disastrous creative choices, and an endless reliance on nostalgia have left the galaxy far, far away in ruins. From the wreckage of the sequel trilogy to the downfall of fan-favorite shows like The Mandalorian and Ahsoka, the evidence is clear. Disney has taken a beloved franchise and turned it into a laughingstock. Is there any hope for Star Wars, or has the Force truly abandoned it forever? Let's uncover how it all went so wrong. When the sequel trilogy was first released, I used to find it amusing when people joked about Disney ruining Star Wars. The idea that such an iconic and beloved franchise could be killed felt absurd. After all, Star Wars is a cultural juggernaut. How could it ever truly die? But looking back now, I realize I may have underestimated just how much damage could be done. Over time, I've witnessed something I cherished deeply deteriorate, losing its heart and soul. Star Wars today feels like a hollow echo of what it once was. Each new release seems to spark more frustration than excitement, and the backlash has grown louder with each passing project. Take, for example, the response to the Acolyte trailer or the game Star Wars Outlaws. Both were met with widespread criticism and skepticism, reflecting the growing disillusionment among fans. Now, I've talked about the state of Star Wars in the past, but this time feels different. My disenchantment with the franchise has reached an all-time high. The legacy of Star Wars, once an unstoppable force in pop culture, has arguably never been in a more precarious position than it is today. To process this disappointment, I felt compelled to reflect on how Disney took something I adored, something that shaped my life and countless others, and transformed it into a shadow of its former glory. I know I'm not alone in feeling this way. Many of you watching likely share similar sentiments. However, if you're someone who still loves Star Wars under Disney's direction and enjoys what they're creating, that's perfectly okay. This video isn't about dismissing those who find joy in the current era of Star Wars. Instead, it's a journey, a kind of therapy to explore how a franchise that once meant so much has lost its way for so many. It's worth noting that when George Lucas sold Star Wars to Disney, the franchise was at a bit of a crossroads. It wasn't as dominant in pop culture as it had been during its peak years. Disney undeniably brought Star Wars back into the limelight with the release of The Force Awakens. The excitement was palpable, and for a brief moment it felt like the magic was returning. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. When The Force Awakens hit theaters, it was nothing short of a cultural explosion. It shattered records, became the highest-grossing domestic film of all time, and seemed to reignite the magic of Star Wars. Fans were ecstatic, critics largely approved, and even though there was some pushback from certain corners of the fandom, it felt like the franchise was firmly back in the spotlight. Then came Rogue One, a bold and refreshing take on the galaxy's story. It added depth to the original trilogy's lore and offered a gripping, grounded war narrative. To this day, it stands out as Disney's strongest contribution to the saga, though that's not saying much considering what came next. The turning point came with The Last Jedi. This movie didn't just divide fans, it completely shattered the unity of the fandom. For some, it was a brilliant subversion of expectations, a bold masterpiece that took risks. For others, it was a disastrous insult to everything Star Wars stood for, betraying characters and derailing the story. Whatever your opinion, it's impossible to deny that this was the moment where cracks in Disney's approach to the franchise became glaringly obvious. The fallout from The Last Jedi was far-reaching. It didn't just spark debates, it retroactively diminished The Force Awakens, as much of its intriguing setup was discarded or ignored. This glaring lack of direction between directors J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson highlighted a fundamental problem. Disney didn't seem to have a cohesive plan for the trilogy. The films felt disjointed, almost as if they were competing against one another rather than building a unified narrative. Fans were left frustrated and bewildered. Still, there was hope. The final installment of the trilogy, The Rise of Skywalker, was supposed to tie it all together, bringing clarity and purpose to the chaotic storytelling. Instead, it became the most criticized of the three, a rushed and incoherent attempt to undo The Last Jedi while also trying to wrap up an epic saga. What should have been a triumphant conclusion turned into a mess, leaving fans disappointed and questioning the future of Star Wars. When Colin Trevorrow was dismissed as the director of Episode IX, it marked a crucial turning point in the chaotic handling of the sequel trilogy. Kathleen Kennedy replaced him with J.J. Abrams, tasking him with an impossible job tying up the loose ends from The Force Awakens while addressing the drastic narrative shifts introduced by The Last Jedi. The result was The Rise of Skywalker, a film that struggled to reconcile two wildly different visions. Abrams attempted to patch things up by bringing back Emperor Palpatine, an inexplicable move that felt more like a desperate grasp at nostalgia than a logical continuation of the story. Characters like Finn were given half-hearted arcs, such as suddenly hinting he was Force-sensitive, but none of these choices landed in a way that satisfied fans. Financially, The Rise of Skywalker was a success, joining the billion-dollar club. However, it was emblematic of the blockbuster mediocrity that defined 2019, a year where many big-budget films made money despite being critically underwhelming. By 2020, it was obvious that Star Wars was no longer the cultural juggernaut it once was. The sequel trilogy had left fans disillusioned, so much so that many reevaluated George Lucas's prequels. Once scorned for their own flaws, the prequels were now seen in a new light, with some fans even apologizing for their past criticisms. It was as if the disappointment of the sequels retroactively improved the reputation of their predecessors, a strange and telling reversal. But the downfall of Star Wars didn't end with the sequel trilogy. Instead, it seemed to mark the beginning of a larger decline. Disney's inability to move the franchise forward became glaringly obvious in the years that followed. Despite The Last Jedi's controversial message about letting go of the past, Disney repeatedly relied on legacy characters and nostalgia to sustain their new stories. This approach was evident in the lineup of Disney shows, which often felt like hollow attempts to cash in on the franchise's history. These series, ranging from great to mediocre to downright bad, highlighted a deeper problem: a creative team that didn't fully understand the essence of Star Wars. Time and again, writers and directors admitted to lacking familiarity with the source material, resulting in storytelling that felt tired, uninspired, and disconnected from the galaxy fans once loved. Disney's reliance on nostalgia didn't stop at mediocre storytelling. It became a cornerstone of their strategy, even when it made little narrative sense. The first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian offered a glimmer of hope, introducing fresh characters and intriguing storylines that felt like a step in the right direction. It was a rare instance of Star Wars delivering something engaging without leaning too heavily on legacy characters. But even this shining example wasn't safe from Disney's creative missteps. By the time Season 3 rolled around, the series had devolved into a forgettable mess, plagued by lackluster writing and directionless plots. Fans were left scratching their heads, wondering how a show that once seemed so promising could lose its way so completely. Even during its strong moments, The Mandalorian couldn't resist the siren call of nostalgia. The appearance of characters like Ahsoka Tano and Luke Skywalker in Season 2, while exciting for some, highlighted Disney's dependency on familiar faces to prop up their stories. These cameos, though undeniably cool, felt unnecessary and detracted from the originality that had initially made the series so appealing. The downward trend continued with The Book of Boba Fett. Instead of giving fans a compelling exploration of the iconic bounty hunter's life post-Return of the Jedi, the series became a disjointed mess. Oddly enough, the best episodes of the show were the ones that didn't even feature Boba Fett. The Mandalorian hijacked the narrative, serving as a reminder of how uninspired the rest of the series was. Fans were left with a version of Boba Fett that didn't resemble the ruthless, cunning character they had grown to love. Instead, he was watered down into a passive figure in his own story, a trend that only reinforced Disney's strategy of using recognizable names for fleeting moments of fanservice rather than meaningful storytelling. And then came Obi-Wan Kenobi, a series that had fans buzzing with anticipation but ultimately delivered more frustration than satisfaction. Bringing back Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan and setting up a rematch with Darth Vader seemed like a surefire hit on paper. But in execution, it became clear that the show was riddled with inconsistencies and ignored established canon. The very premise of Obi-Wan and Vader meeting again before their iconic battle in A New Hope stretched credibility to its limits. Yet, despite these glaring issues, many fans were willing to overlook the flaws simply because the idea of seeing McGregor and Hayden Christensen back in their legendary roles was so tantalizing. Disney's reliance on nostalgia and fan-favorite cameos has repeatedly masked an inability to deliver fresh, compelling stories, a pattern that fans are finding increasingly frustrating. It was as though they believed sprinkling in iconic figures could fix fundamental problems with the writing and direction, but the cracks in their strategy were becoming harder to ignore. The failure of Obi-Wan Kenobi was emblematic of Disney's broader struggles with Star Wars. What could have been a poignant exploration of Obi-Wan's internal struggles and his fractured relationship with Anakin was instead diluted by questionable creative decisions. Introducing Reva, a new character who lacked the depth and complexity needed to justify her screen time, only highlighted the disconnect between Disney's vision and fan expectation. The comparisons to the second sister from Jedi Fallen Order were unavoidable, but while that character had nuance and compelling motivations, Reva felt like an uninspired imitation, shoehorned into the story without earning her place. Deborah Chow's direction didn't help matters. The overuse of shaky cam and poorly staged action sequences screamed of budget constraints rather than creative vision. The much-anticipated confrontation between Obi-Wan and Vader, instead of being an epic clash steeped in emotion and history, looked amateurish, like it was filmed at the closest construction site available. Add to that Joby Harold's admitted lack of familiarity with Star Wars, and it became painfully clear that the series was mishandled at every level. Despite these glaring flaws, there were glimmers of brilliance, particularly in the performances of Ewan McGregor and Hayden Christensen. McGregor brought gravitas to Obi-Wan, capturing the character's guilt and longing for redemption, while Christensen shone in the moments he was given, reminding fans why his portrayal of Anakin Vader is so iconic. But these performances couldn't save a show weighed down by inconsistent writing and misplaced priorities. Then came Andor, a show that shocked audiences by proving Star Wars could still deliver exceptional storytelling. Unlike its predecessors, Andor didn't lean on lightsabers, Jedi lore, or nostalgia to tell its story. Instead, it focused on grounded, character-driven narratives with sharp writing, nuanced dialogue, and a fresh perspective on the Star Wars universe. It rejected the trope-filled spectacle of recent efforts and gave us a story that felt mature, intelligent, and deliberate. The irony of Andor's success was that its biggest criticism, that it didn't feel like Star Wars, was actually its greatest strength. By breaking away from the overused formulas and cameo-driven storytelling, Andor reminded fans of what Star Wars could be when unshackled from the weight of its own legacy. Its absence of lightsabers or traditional fan service alienated some viewers, but for those craving substance, it was a revelation. However, just as Andor gave fans a glimmer of hope, Disney reverted to its old habits with Ahsoka. For many, Ahsoka is a beloved character, and the potential for a meaningful continuation of her story was immense. But as history has shown, Disney's track record with Star Wars means that even the most promising concepts are often met with disappointment. Star Wars fans had high hopes for the Ahsoka series. Ahsoka Tano, a fan-favorite character from the Clone Wars and Rebels, had grown into one of the most compelling figures in the Star Wars universe. Her evolution from Anakin's apprentice to a powerful independent leader was one of the most praised storylines across the animated series, so when her live-action show was announced, expectations were high. But unfortunately, Ahsoka failed to deliver on its potential, turning what should have been a thrilling continuation of her story into another uninspired entry in Disney's Star Wars catalog. Previously dynamic characters now felt flat and uninteresting, and even Thrawn, a fan-favorite antagonist known for his cunning and ruthlessness, was a major letdown. The show's production design, despite its budget, gave off an air of mediocrity, resembling a run-of-the-mill Disney project rather than something that could stand toe-to-toe with the legacy of Star Wars. The constant reliance on cameos such as Hayden Christensen's return as Anakin felt forced. While Anakin's presence made sense within the context of Ahsoka's character arc, these cameos were meant to enhance the story, not serve as its driving force. Unfortunately, they became the focal point, turning what could have been a deep character-driven narrative into a fan service-heavy spectacle. One of the few redeeming qualities of the series was the character of Baylan Skoll, portrayed by the late Ray Stevenson. His performance brought a depth and complexity to a new character, one that stood out in an otherwise lackluster series. Tragically, with Stevenson's passing, the future of Baylan Skoll's character remains uncertain, and the show lost a potentially great narrative thread. As Ahsoka fades into disappointment, fans now turn their eyes to the Acolyte, a project already mired in controversy before its debut. Leslie Headland, the showrunner, has faced heavy criticism, particularly due to her tendency to focus on personal ideologies rather than crafting a story that serves the Star Wars universe. While Headland has demonstrated knowledge of Star Wars lore, many fans fear that her approach to the series will prioritize self-expression over the integrity of the beloved franchise. The concern is that the Acolyte will fall into the same traps that plagued previous projects, using the Star Wars brand to push agendas instead of creating a compelling narrative. And then there's the looming Rey movie, which feels like another example of Disney being out of touch with what Star Wars fans truly want. The sequel trilogy left many fans disappointed, especially with Rey's character arc and the rushed nature of the story. Bringing her back in a new film without a clear plan or vision for the future feels like a desperate attempt to recapture past glory, rather than moving the saga forward in a meaningful way. Fans are left wondering whether Disney is capable of revitalizing Star Wars, or if the franchise is doomed to continue its downward trajectory driven by misguided decisions and an inability to understand the core of what made Star Wars great in the first place. Disney's handling of Star Wars over the years has left many fans disheartened, especially when you look at the potential of characters like Rey. Daisy Ridley did her best with a character who was set up to be one of the strongest in the franchise, but the writers repeatedly failed her. The constant changes to her lineage, the lack of clear direction, and the overall mishandling of her arc left her character with little emotional weight. And let's be real, the rise of Skywalker felt like a rushed attempt to clean up the mess left by The Last Jedi and The Force Awakens. Daisy's still making bank with this Rey movie, but the fact that we're even getting another film with her character after all that's happened shows just how disconnected Disney is from what fans actually want. The upcoming original movie from James Mangold does give some hope. After all, Logan was a masterpiece, but then there's Indiana Jones 5, so yeah, it's hard to say what to expect. On the other hand, Dave Filoni's movie might be exciting for some, bringing together all the Disney Plus shows, but honestly, how much are we supposed to care when so many of these shows have been disappointing? The Mandalorian started strong, but by the end of Season 3, it felt like we were in Thor the Dark World territory, setting up big things, but with a lot of filler in between. The only thing that seems to have consistently delivered is the Jedi game series Fallen Order and Survivor have been highlights in an otherwise grim Star Wars landscape. And honestly, that's just where I'm at. I used to be a huge Star Wars fan, but the way Disney has run this franchise into the ground is hard to ignore. It's frustrating. I can still enjoy the originals, the prequels, and the games, but everything coming out under Disney's reign just pushes me further and further away from a franchise I once loved. So, I know I'm not alone here. How many of you feel the same way? Are you still hopeful for the future of Star Wars, or have you already checked out? Can Disney ever get it right? Or is it just too far gone at this point? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Are you still hopeful for Star Wars, or have you checked out? Don't forget to subscribe to Movie Saga and hit the bell icon for more updates. Thanks for watching, and take care.